So thank you both, and thank you for inviting us today as well. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, good. Trying to aim my voice at the microphone all the time. So we're really grateful to be able to present some of our findings. So what we're going to cover with you today is some of the figures that we have from our evidence that we get from the clients that we support. So just to move on to the next one to start off with. So, sorry, I just need to look. There's a slide look on the screen. So we're going to cover the story so far. We're looking at the next chapter, the impact, and then just a very brief overview of the services that we do for if anybody isn't familiar with those at all. So on the story so far, the data that we're going to cover comes from March 2020, which will probably be quite familiar to you. It was that lockdown start that we all had that was imminent and fast. And this chart, I know you won't be able to see all of the figures on it, but on the left-hand side of the chart, it shows the number of clients that we supported at Bassetlaw Citizens Advice. And then the different colours are the years, which shows the trend. So you'll see the yellow line at the top, the kind of mustard yellow one, are the figures that we've got for 2023 for what we've seen so far this year. And to headline some of the figures there, the trend for 2023 is certainly higher than it was in 2022 when you compare year on year. And by the end of May 2023, we've given 4,312, to be precise, clients our advice. Now that's actually, when you compare it back to 2020, 78% higher than it was then. So we've seen a massive increase in people needing help and advice, but also there's been a steady increase as well. The big story is that we expect that there's going to be more people needing a lot more advice into 2023, and we expect that we'll probably break the 10,000 figure of the clients that are supported by following, and that's analysed from the trends that we have on there. When we do the presentation today, we'll be covering part of the local figures, but also the national, because it's going to cover some of the national slides that will be clear as to which is which. Additionally, we monitor our website, as I know a lot of other organisations do, and over 18,000 hits on our website. So not only are we giving one-to-one advice, in addition to that, people are seeking advice from the website, which is linked to general advice and support. So people are able to help themselves if they have the capacity to do that. Also, big thank you to our valued partners as well, because so many of you are in the room today as well. But we know that you signpost, you refer to us, and we're really grateful for that joined up service that everybody does, and the way in which we can all work together to help people, because it does make a difference. So the next one is a map of Bassetlaw, so you probably recognise that. And on that it shows the more dense areas that people have come to us for advice are the darker blue segments. So no surprises probably with some of the areas that we have on there. So the darker blue areas obviously cover urban areas, but also there are the rural areas that you can see in there. We get that information from the postcodes, so when we support a client, we always take their details, the demographics, and we actually show that on our systems, and then we're able to print out the data from that as well. Also, despite the map on the demographics, we're finding that the cost of living crisis isn't helping everybody equally, isn't affecting everybody equally. And we are finding, and this is probably no surprise, but people with mental health conditions, it's inextricably linked to a low income, and then that also affects on debt. So you often find that that is affecting people differently, but the thing that we have found as well this year is that more people are contacting our services than probably would do normally. So in other words, a lot of people are coming to us for the first time, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. So I think it's affecting people differently. It's affecting more people that are working in a different way for the cost of living crisis. So where there are mortgage increases, where there is inflation, the things that Steve mentioned earlier, we're certainly seeing the impact on that as well. So the next slide, I know that looks very busy, probably can't make sense of that from a distance, but that is about the complexity of the issues that people come to us with. So that shows over the years, so it starts from the left at June 2020. So we found that people would come to us with an average of probably 2 queries, 2 issues when they needed our support. Now, in May 23, we're seeing that's more near the 4 figure, so 3.8 exactly. But that means that people have got more complex issues and a combination of issues as well. The other thing that we're finding, the knock-on effect on that, is that it's taken us longer for us to try and deal with those queries with people. It's a little bit like taking the layers off an onion. You know, you're trying to unravel what's the priority problem that we need to support them with, and then how can we help that and how can we make them realise that that's the priority that they need to focus on as well. So we assess their capacity in dealing with that. Got another very busy chart here, but again this is from the data that we have, and this is really about what are those issues. So when we talk about issues at Citizens Advice, we talk about the things that people come to us for help. So the top 5 inquiry areas that we consistently see, and certainly have done since 2020, are around benefits, debt, energy, housing issues, and also employment. And we can see the trends. So for example, in 2020, it was a big year about furlough and employment problems. So people had different inquiries at the start of COVID. A lot of them were about holidays that were booked as well. So what do I do because I can't go on holiday? So the trends changed, and then it was about redundancy in terms of employment. Now we're seeing an increase on housing issues, but certainly benefits and debt remain the highest one as well. We used to see that a lot of people came in about council tax areas, and that's still quite high. Excuse me. But now fuel debt is the highest by far. So another big story there about how energy is affecting people. And for an example, so people relying on universal credit, for example, get a set amount of money. That tends to be worse for those that are in privately rented accommodation because they're struggling to manage the rent increases that they have. So the basic benefits income, less their essential expenditure, creates a weekly shortfall, which is a lot of what we're seeing. And that's called a negative budget in terms of how we at Citizens Advice refer to it, and I know other organisations do as well. There's been some analysis by National Citizens Advice where they've looked at those figures, and then they've seen that over a period of time, because there's this gradual shortfall, in a very short period of time, in a few months, that can result in a debt of over £3,000, because it's impossible where there's a shortfall for someone to try and pick up on that, and that's people just living on the basic stuff that they need to live on as well, and also relying on food parcels and food support as well, so that's having a massive impact. So I'm just going to hand over to Chris now for the next slide. I think I've gone on too far. There you go. Okay.
Thank you very much. So what Karen is giving you when she goes through her slides is a local picture. But I think it's really interesting to look at that in relation to where Bassetlaw sits nationally as well. So on the left is, let me scroll down a little bit on the slide. Excuse me. You can just see it at the bottom, but essentially what we're seeing on the left is Bassetlaw. Thank you very much. My able assistant. is unremarkable. At the beginning of 2019, Bassetlaw is unremarkable as a picture in the country. It is a typical weight of demand in our area. Now, we'll see whether I can drive this through on here. Hold me a second, I'm going to swap onto a different view because I'm just struggling with this one. So I've just made it even smaller, so apologies for that, but we'll just have to bear with it for a second. What we're seeing is in the last quarter, Bassetlaw has gone from being a typical district to being one of the outliers in the entirety of England and Wales. Bassetlaw is in the top 5 of demand for citizens' advice across the entire country. And that's come from a place, as you can see at the beginning of 2019, where we're unremarkable. So there are only 4 other places in the country that are busier than Bassetlaw and have more people who are coming and looking for crisis support than they are at this time as we were in the last quarter. On a national picture as well, the vast majority of demand is being fueled by the amount of people who cannot afford to top up their prepayment meters. So again, another busy chart, and I apologise for that. But what this is essentially showing at the bottom are the other years before, how many times people approached us and said that at the moment they cannot top up their prepayment meters. At the bottom we've got 2019, 2020, 2021, and a huge rise in 2022. It's not unexpected, is it, knowing what we know about 2022. But where the remarkable rise comes is that huge outlying line for 2023. Because if we thought 2022 was bad, 2023 has almost reached those levels already. We'll come on to what we think is going to happen next in a short while. But essentially what this is saying is that people have lost their resilience. 2022, the growth in line was largely grown by the winter temperatures and people needing to feed the meters more. In 2023, there doesn't seem to be an equal explanation for why in May it was one of our busiest months on record for people telling us they can't feed their prepayment meters. So we have to assume it isn't the weather this time, it's that people's resilience has been eroded. And if it's been eroded in May, where are we going to be 4 or so months from now, when the weather does start turning? If there's no resilience now, how's it going to be when energy bills goes up? Also, I think you'll notice on this chart that there's been 2 energy caps in this time. So energy bills have actually reduced twice, and yet the line in 2023 is still heading upwards. So in other words, we're reducing energy bills and reducing cost per unit for gas and electric. It's actually had no effect on the rise of that 2023 line. So who is it who can't afford to feed the meter at the moment? And I think this is going to be a surprising answer for many of us. Because on the left, it shows that the 2 main bars, almost 80% of people who came and said they couldn't feed a meter, they weren't couples with children, they weren't couples. It was single people, and single people with children who can probably properly look at the future. So I think it's really interesting to see that, yes, locally, we've seen more demand than we ever had before, and locally we've seen more prepayment action than we ever had before. But in a context of a national picture, Bassetlaw is a particular hotspot. So we've spoken about what's happening right now, so we're just going to talk about what's going to happen in the coming months.
Okay, so looking at the next chapter, which is what we've been having a look at and using those trends. So we've already spoken about the fact that we expect that the Bassetlaw Citizens Advice will break the 10,000 client barrier this year. We also monitor the number of times that people come into the offices. So we expect that's going to be something like 38,000. Not necessarily coming into the offices, we use a number of channels to deliver our service, so whether it's digital or whether it's in person, that will be included in that. And expecting that there'll be a further 20% increase because of the knock-on effect of the cost of living on people as well. So just moving on to the next slide, which is not doing. Yeah, thank you. It's okay. So this one, we've basically just shown that information on the 2 graphs that you can see there. So we're showing the number of clients with 2023 being the column at the right that we expect, and then the interventions being the one at the far right below that as well. So, just move on to the next slide, thank you, which is yours. Yeah. Okay.
So, alongside that record demand and a record forecast coming through, what is driving this essentially is this question. Karen mentioned it earlier that we're particularly concerned about what we're seeing about people's median income. But what we saw for the first time in the last quarter, that's January to March 2023, is for the first time the average household has sunk into a deficit budget. So on average, a household will now be expending more than they take in on income on a monthly basis. And that's incredible, isn't it? Because you know what inevitably is going to happen through there. Regardless of what resilience you have, regardless of what support structure you have around you, you cannot indefinitely continue in this circumstance, the circumstance of a deficit budget, without going into debt. And essentially, that is our message for 2023, is that this is going to be the year of debt. Resilience is eroded. We've had 2 years of COVID, we've had a cost of living crisis, and then this year around, we're already seeing record numbers in May. But we're seeing deficit budgets across the board, and it's inevitably going to cause debt. And again, if we break this down into who in particular is affected by that deficit budget, there's some really eye-opening breakdowns. So, household type. Again, if you remember from the slides earlier, it's single parents and single adults who are going to be mostly affected, because what we're seeing is that they are far more likely to be in deficit budget than couples or couples with children. Just bear with me a second as I draw the slides. People of colour are far, far more likely to be in deficit budget than people who are white. People who are disabled are more likely to be in a deficit budget. Mortgage holders and private rental people are again extremely more likely to be in a deficit budget than those who are in social housing or owner-occupier housing. We're assuming that's because they are far more susceptible to the rise in interest rates at the moment than perhaps those in social housing or owner-occupied housing. But that mortgage spike in particular is incredibly worrying. Karen mentioned earlier that we're seeing new people to our service, and this is just another marker for that really. We're going to be seeing people that we just don't typically expect to see, completely new households coming along. Age groups again, really faint at the top, but at the top, on an average positive income, is 65 plus. So again, it isn't the people that we might expect coming to see us, because all the other age categories, without exception, are going to be in deficit budget on average, whereas 65 plus are going to remain a small surplus. So let's continue on down. And the last chart that I have, just to switch things up, is the amount of debt issues that nationally we are helping people at the moment. Again, I know this is impossibly small, so I will try and explain what's going on. But essentially, the huge dips that you can see at the beginning of 2020 are where enforcement for creditors was suspended during COVID. So when there was no enforcement, there was nothing driving people to go and get debt advice. So we saw huge dips. And ever since that time, we've seen a recovery in the amount of numbers of people who are seeking debt advice. But what is particularly concerning is a huge and aggressive rise on the right-hand side of the chart, which reflects how quickly and how inextricably that debt is rising in the last few months. And the right-hand chart shows just energy debt. So what it's showing is that predominantly what's driving this current huge rise in demand is the amount of people who are struggling to pay energy debts. Typically, what we used to see is that most debts that happened, or most debts that were reported, were debts with council tax. So universal liability, almost every household has a responsibility to pay council tax, whereas other categories are more dilute. Some people have a rent, some people have a mortgage. So council tax was the bellwether of how widespread debt was in a particular area. But over the last few months, we've seen energy take that over. And again, I'll just reiterate that that's despite the fact that energy bills have now gone up twice since her peak, but still debt's rising nonetheless. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit, no more graphs on this one, sorry about all the graphs. I just want to talk a little bit about the impact on people. So thinking about an example of where mental health and low income is really linked and has an impact. Let's use Jane as an example, fictitious lady that we've used, or an anonymised lady's name, age 60, person who's widowed, and is no longer able to work because of multiple health conditions. They're quite severe, those health conditions. So the lady was affected by a stroke, suffered memory loss, mobility issues as well, and then as effect, mental health has got worse, depression, and continued low income as well. So that's a typical client that we might see, and I know a lot of other organisations, would probably work with that client as well, or those, those categories as well. So we did an assessment of the person's capacity, of Jane's capacity to deal with her issues, and then looked at how we can try and help her financially to ease the burden of some of those problems, but also work with partners as to how we can then look at supporting the mental health problems that she was going through as well. The outcomes that we did to try and get her out of the cycle, because I think this is the thing, people have this recurring cycle, it's really difficult for them to get out of that. We sorted a debt relief order to try and work with the, so that she could manage the debts, obviously. A referral to a support worker, a referral to Mind, looked at the options to increase her income, to maximise her income, to reduce her expenditure, which was very limitedly what she was spending it on anyway, so it's very difficult to do that. And then also to look at health benefits that she wasn't getting, so personal independence payment is a key benefit that people are entitled to, but is quite difficult to get and takes quite a long time to process as well. So in the meantime, it's really difficult to get him out of that cycle for that person as well. And then the crisis support that has been available, that's been a massive increase. So things like the household support fund, the food bank parcels, the food hubs, all really make a difference, but then people shouldn't have to rely on those, and this is what we're seeing, that there's a general reliance upon that support, which shouldn't be there as well. So we try and get to the root of the problem, but sometimes it's really difficult because people just can't get out of that cycle. So the next slide that we've got is really just a summary of how the impact is on people, but also on services as well. So health inequalities is massive. There's risks of healthy living for people, so trying to keep warm, people that are ill find it increasingly difficult to keep warm, eating, lighting their home, all those things, we're seeing that is a big problem still for people. The risks to people living independently, so people who may need a care package or care support, it's really difficult for them to afford that if they haven't got the income to pay for it, and they have to pay for it themselves. And then there's the care needs that they need themselves, whether it's equipment, in addition to the support that they would need. And then that brings isolation and loneliness and increased mental health problems for people. And then also the risk of debt. So again, it's getting back into this cycle. And then the risk of loan sharks can be a problem as well. So these are all concerns that we have of what the impact is and what it's likely to increase to be as well. And then the impact on services. So for all of our services, we have stretched resources, we have stressed staff. Their mental health and well-being is important as well for them to be able to do the job that they do and to support all the people that we help as well. Waiting list for clients. People need to be seen quickly when they're in crisis, but that's not always possible. and we're all doing the best that we can to try and do that as well. So I'll just hand over to Chris for the last slide. Thank you.
So we wish we had a happier picture for you, but essentially what we're saying is that we're seeing more people than we've ever seen. They have more complex needs than we've ever seen, and things are only going to become worse as summer transitions into autumn and winter this year. The deficit budgets are the key piece of intelligence. It's simple maths. If somebody isn't affording their household budget right now, they certainly aren't going to be in a few months' time. And inevitably, at some point, however long they can stave it off, they're going to end up in serious debt problems and having to make impossible decisions before too long. As a service, we have 4 main means of contact for clients. That's just a quick plug, I promise. But one of the things we noticed in COVID is how quickly our face-to-face advice evaporated and went into digital channels. But one of the challenges post-COVID for us has been that face-to-face has been coming back to the same levels it has before COVID, but that the demand for our digital channels hasn't dropped. People are living complex lives. They've got multiple jobs, they're caring for people, they're caring for children, they're single parents, and when people don't seem to have the time to come down and see us, which is why we were so grateful to receive a grant from the Bassetlaw Council to enable us to bring up the cost of living helpline. So we will just take a brief pause to see whether there's any questions, but also to say that there is a monthly cost of living briefing from Citizens Advice, which is from the National Chief Executive. There's usually a few guest speakers, politicians, Martin Lewis, that kind of luminary. They're usually really useful intelligence about what's coming up, and some of these slides have been shamelessly pilfered from the last presentation we did. There's a tip sheet, QR code on the screen if anybody would like to sign up, or you can see our email addresses there and we'll happily send you through the Eventbrite link as well. So thank you very much, and if there's any questions, please give them a go.
Yeah.
Do you want to hand some sort of